and they've always been a big hit. So I'm very excited to jump into things this afternoon, but I want to make a few announcements first. As always, speaker view is going to be the best way to watch today's session, and the chat on the bottom right on Zoom is open, and we're going to do our best to grab as many questions as we can as we go along today. I know a lot of these issues are business specific, so I may not be able to grab them all, but any general question, anything that can help you or the other travel advisors on today's session, I'll do my best to share. So please don't be shy. Please go ahead and drop your thoughts, your concerns, your questions in there. I also want to thank Kareem George for joining me on here a couple of weeks ago to talk about reconnecting with clients as travel picks back up. I want to remind all those who missed that episode that it is available for free and on demand on TMR's YouTube page and on our training tab on travelmarketreport.com. You can head there and watch that session or however many other sessions you want to watch on your own time, on demand. It's a great resource for a lot of our readers and a lot of advisors. Also that and all the other check-in episodes, which is our podcast, is available on that YouTube page. The last check-in episode we did was with Royal Caribbean's Vicky Fried, and that just launched on Tuesday. Vicky's been a major part of the cruise industry for so long, but in the episode, she was kind enough to tell me a little bit about her beginnings in the industry and her outlook on things moving forward. So that, along with some other content, including a pretty recent ship tour of the new Virgin Voyages ship, is all available there. And as always, you can subscribe and like and comment and be notified when new content goes up there going forward. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off today because I know this is a very important topic for so many of you. Today, I am very happy to welcome Chun Wright to Master Advisor to talk about liability waivers for travel agents. Chun is the owner of the law office of Chun T. Wright, based in Washington, D.C., and it is an advisory member of the Adventure Travel Trade Association. I'm going to let her share a little bit more about her background, but she is a lifelong traveler, having spent 3 years in Italy and explored over 50 countries across the world. Her travel list includes Everest Base Camp trek and climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. So it's very clear she's a deep love for travel in the industry, and I'm very happy to welcome her to the program and get her thoughts on all things travel and legal issues.
Thank you, Daniel, for that great introduction, and great to see everyone participating today. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to talk about waivers, which is really a topic that's close to my heart and an area that I practice deeply in. I just want to take a moment to thank Tom for all the technical help and also TMR for having this session today. Okay, I'm a lawyer. I have to give a disclaimer. This is the thing that we do. So this is not legal advice. No matter what I say today, do not rely on it. I would say consult an attorney about your own specific situation. So with respect to my background, you heard a little bit about it. One of my core practice areas is working with the travel industry. I represent mostly adventure travel companies as well as travel agents, host agencies, and we advise on a wide range of issues, ranging from risk management to contracts to intellectual property. Risk management has been a big issue with the pandemic, of course, but when people start to travel, one of the areas we help out with is when something happens during a trip. We're not having so much of those questions these days because people aren't traveling, but they will be coming up in the months to come. Prior to starting my own practice, I was a litigator at major law firms in San Francisco Bay Area. I was also a federal prosecutor in DC and VP at a major trade association representing the video game industry. But all of my experience really comes into play in how I advise travel companies in all the different areas. As Daniel said, I pretty much came out of the womb traveling. I grew up in a military family, so it is pretty much in my DNA.
Yeah, and I want to get into the topic of the day, but I do want to ask you, I mean, you've done so much adventure travel. I mean, do you have a favorite experience you could just share with us before we get into the waivers issue today, just so we can sort of learn a bit about you?
Yeah, so I am just so bad with favorites. If you ask me my favorite color, my favorite thing, I am terrible. I can't pick one thing because I love everything. But I would say, I certainly love city experiences. Locally, of course, New York is amazing. San Francisco. I love having, a croissant in Paris. checking out art museums. But I also love adventure, anything that takes me out of my comfort zone, meeting new people, new cultures. So I would say some of my favorites have really been places that were just so different from home here in the United States. Nepal was definitely a big favorite. Um, I loved my first safari that was in South Africa, but Tanzania and Namibia were amazing. I finally made it to South America probably 3 or 4 years ago. And I thought Chile was amazing, just with the variety of things to do. But anything involving adventure, I'm there.
Okay. All right. So I let's switch to the topic of the day. And I have a list of questions here, and I know a lot of people on the call will have questions too. So please drop them in the chat if you do have questions. But I want to ask some basic ones first, just to get us on some firm footing going forward. Can you give us a sort of short description of what a liability waiver entails and why it's important for advisors to consider it and to have it a part of their business?
Yeah, so it's absolutely essential to have a liability waiver, either as a standalone document or to have a waiver provision within your terms and conditions. And whether you have it as a standalone or a separate document will depend on your business and the risk. I usually do recommend a standalone document, but we can talk a little bit about that later. But it is essentially, if it's drafted properly, it is a contract legally binding between you, the travel company, and the traveler. And it's what it does is it educates the traveler about the risk of a trip, the known risk and the inherent risk of a trip. And it releases a travel company from liability for any harm or financial damage that might arise from your ordinary negligence.
Okay. Okay, and I know we've done a legal session prior on Master Advisor, and we spoke a lot about in that session about terms and conditions. And I'm wondering if you could just guide us through a little bit about the differences between the waiver you just spoke about in terms of conditions, and what's the primary purpose and the differences in the primary purposes of each of those.
Yes, so you will hear people talk about terms and conditions and waivers. Sometimes people just talk about terms and conditions. If you think about it, a waiver, regardless of whether it's in a standalone document or within a terms and conditions, it is a specific legal vehicle that seeks to reduce your liability or eliminate it altogether. So it's the narrow. The terms and conditions I think of as a broader agreement. It's akin to a contractual roadmap or guidebook to your trip. What you'll find in a terms and conditions, you'll cover, I would say, don't be scared of terms and conditions. They can be long, but it tells you everything you need to know about a trip, right? And you want your traveler to understand the rules of the road. You don't want to figure it out later. You don't want surprises. So the terms and conditions will cover anything that you want, but typically it covers payment and cancellation terms, right? Because it's legally binding what you say and represent to travelers about how and when they get their money back. It includes force majeure language, an area that people are really focusing on now with the pandemic. What happens if something out of your control happens? What does that mean for the traveler in terms of what happens with their trip or what happens to their money? All those things can be addressed in the terms and conditions. Insurance, right? If you mandate travel insurance or don't or recommend it, that goes into the terms and conditions. Passport and visa requirements, baggage requirements, medical requirements, and so forth, right? How should people act on a trip, a code of conduct? Within the terms and conditions, should you choose not to have a standalone waiver, you can put waiver language into your terms and conditions, right? But it's the waiver language is doing a specific thing. It's trying to release your liability. Okay. But essentially they're two different, I like to treat them as two different contracts.
Okay. Okay. So they're separate contracts, but there can be some overlap, it seems like, too. I'm curious for the advisors who are on the call. I mean, how many of you do have terms and conditions on your website or as part of your regular client communication? If you want to drop that answer in the chat, that would be great. But I'm curious because this has always been a big issue even before COVID, terms and conditions and legal issues with travel advisors and their clients because so many things can happen. I want to ask you about that. I mean, what can happen if we go back to the liability waiver discussion? What can happen with no liability waiver? What's the danger for travel advisors who might not have this a part of their business right now?
And just so you know, I've got some notes here, so I want to make sure that we cover everything. But the danger of not having a waiver is you will be deprived of some very important legal defenses should you get sued, right? To note, a waiver is not going to be the silver bullet that keeps you from getting sued.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can file a lawsuit, even if it's frivolous. Maybe not so frivolous. Maybe there's something there. Maybe they have a weak claim, but they simply need to go to the courthouse, pay a couple $100s, file their lawsuit, right? So waiver isn't going to be standing at the courthouse stopping people. But what it gives you is the ability, if you are sued, there's sort of two key defenses you'll be asserting if someone's hurt or if there's some sort of financial liability. And one is they contractually agreed not to sue you and to release you from any claims, right? So you won't have that contract defense because they didn't sign a waiver. The second defense that you will have available is something called assumption of risk, right? So let's say someone's hurt on a trip, they're hurt on a safari. Some wild animal comes to the safari vehicle and turns it over. Well, that's an inherent risk. That can happen, right? There's nothing you can do. Part of being out with nature is enjoying it, but also kind of taking on these risks, right? So you actually don't need, let's say, the waiver document to make the argument that a person assumed the risk. But it will be up to you to defend yourself by pointing out, well, how did the person know they were assuming that risk? And we'll point to things like, well, on National Geographic, they had a show where stuff like this happened. People knew this was a possibility. If you don't have that language in a waiver, you don't have a waiver, you won't be able to, sort of show the waiver and say, they assumed that risk and they knew this was a possibility because we said it right here. We said it during our safety briefings. So you'll be deprived of having an additional piece of evidence to prove up an assumption of risk defense. Yeah. The other problem some of you may have encountered, or if you have not, when you try to get insurance, your insurance company may ask you, do you have any waiver language, right? Because they want to see that you're taking steps to minimize risk. So you might not be able to get insurance or get a good rate if you don't have a waiver.
So, I mean, it seems to have come down like these are the best practices for advisors who both want to be successful with their agency and continuously protect their business. These are the things that are going to make it a little easier to sleep at night when something does go wrong in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, again, being in the travel industry, you are facing inherent risk to your business. Stuff will happen on trips. They can, and they do happen. They happen in life, right? Just by living, we face risk every day. The idea is that if you put a number of things in place, you can sleep better at night because you will have done everything that you could to take that risk and bring it down as small as possible. And that's what will allow you to sleep at night. Okay. Getting risk down to zero, like nothing's going to happen on a trip. That's a myth. It can't happen.
Yeah, and I want to grab some questions now because I know there's going to be a bunch of questions that are coming into the chat today, and I see a couple of ones already. And I know we're not going to be able to answer all these, but I do want to try to I do want to pass them along. And I know you've already gone through a disclaimer, so for anyone who's come in late, just make sure this recording does have the beginning, does have a disclaimer in it. But we have a question here from Richard, and he wants to know, what is the better option, terms and conditions with required acknowledgement or an official travel planning and management contract with obvious signature requirements? Are you familiar with the latter, and Would you be able to talk us through that a little bit?
So is the question kind of having terms and conditions with some acknowledgement that falls short of the signature? Is that the way I'm interpreting?
Uh, it's terms and conditions versus a travel contract. It's something if well, maybe we can wait for Richard to maybe clarify that a little bit, and we'll circle back to it.
Okay. Yes, I mean, you always, but we can circle back to it. I will say
Okay.
that, having someone sign a waiver is always preferable, because you want that signature on it.
Yeah. So let's get into building a terms and conditions sheet because I know, or building a liability waiver because I know that's what a lot of advisors here on the call are looking for guidance to do. And I know from the answers previously from the question I asked that there are some advisors on here who have neither liability waivers or terms and conditions a part of their business, or they have ones that they recognize need to be updated. So I'm curious if you were a travel advisor, what would your first step be for building a liability waiver to use for your business?
Sure, I think so. I assume on the call we have people at various stages of their business. So if I were brand new, I think the first thing I would do, if I was working with a host agency, would be just find those resources that may already be there because I don't think you should skimp on legal for something so important. I think that's part of the business and having that as part of the budget. But you also don't need to reinvent the wheel if you have resources available to you. So I check with my host agency. I would check with my trade association and see if they already have something. And from there, I would, if they do, I would probably still check with a lawyer to ensure that that waiver fits within my state law because waivers are governed by state law. And so you want to make sure that whatever's in the waiver is consistent with state law. Plus, during your life as a business owner, you want to have good advisors, right? A good team, a great marketing person, a great accounting person, but you also want a good legal person, right? And developing those relationships early, you can have a trusted partner who understands your business. And as things come up, you know who to call, right? You don't have to panic after the fact. So probably in that order, check with the host agency or trade association, see what they have, and then consult a lawyer. To the extent that you want to save on costs, if you have a waiver and it's decent, it's a lot less expensive for me to take a waiver that already exists and tweak it versus crafting it from whole cloth.
Yeah. And are there, I mean, you spoke about taking a decent waiver. I mean, what is typically in a decent waiver? Are there sort of bedrock things that are usually always included in those waivers that you would look at and be like, this is pretty good. I can work with this pretty easily.
Sure. I mean, I think if you look at all waivers, decently drafted ones, and I would encourage you, take a look at some of the big companies, see what their waivers say, and you'll start to see a pattern. So you always want to make sure, of course, that the beginning of the waiver explains who the contract is between, right? Like make sure that you put your company name, your formal company name. You might have a DBA, doing business as. So make sure that you're correctly stating the entity. I can't tell you how contracts or how many times courts look and see who's the contracting party. And if you don't have that right, or if you're not including, maybe you have some business affiliates that really should be identified. I'm not talking about necessarily white label situations, but situations where you just want to make sure all the parties are accurately put in there. That's step one. The next thing is you want to identify the risks of the trip. Okay. The major risks. You can't possibly list everything under the sun, and there's no expectation that you do that. But think about what the real risk of your travel services are. Articulate those at a general level. So there's going to be a risk section. There's also going to be, and with respect to the risk, you'll want to cover things like things that could lead to financial loss and things that can lead to physical loss. You'll want to include assumption of the risk language that we just discussed. You will also need to include, a good thing to include is the choice of law venue, right? If there's a dispute over the waiver, where is the lawsuit supposed to be filed? You can put that into the contract. You want a general release. That's really sort of the heart of it. That a person is releasing you from all claims and that they are not going to sue you. That part is really important, and it's really important to identify who the released parties are, to include, and this is often overlooked, so this is a tip, include your successors and assign. So let's say it's Chun's travel company. I would want a release that says, you, traveler, will not sue, right? And you waive all claims against me, my officers, my directors, maybe my contractors, my representatives, but my successors and assigns. And the reason why that's important is your company could end up getting sold, or you could end up maybe converting it to a different type of entity. And if you don't have the successors and assigns language, it leaves you vulnerable to an argument that the release doesn't apply to this sort of new company, right? So it's important to make sure the successors and assigns are listed. And then you'll also want to make sure there's a signature, right? An acknowledgement. And much of this language, and we can talk about this in a bit, but it really needs to be prominent. You can't sort of play hide the ball with something so important.
Yeah. And I know we don't want to. I know there was a question in the chat about sample waivers, and I don't think we're going to give any out right now, because I don't think that's our purpose today. But I want to keep I do want to keep grabbing questions from the chat too. But if you are looking for a sample waiver, I'm sure contacting your host agency or contacting ASTA or ACTA or whatever your trade association might be is a good place to start, like you mentioned before.
Yes, and also check with your insurer. I've seen some insurance companies that provide some sample waiver language, so that can at least get you started.
All right, so I see Richard clarified his question. I'm going to grab that in a second, but we do have a question that I think is going to be good for a lot of advisors now, to know the answer to, and it's from Alyssa West. And she wants to know that she wants to say that she's a small group that started their trip planning in 2019 and is now leaving for a trip in October. She said she did not use a liability waiver. Are there any options for her to do anything about it right now?
Well, yeah, so this is a situation that goes into the timing, right, of people signing waivers. You could create a waiver and let everybody know they have to sign it, but you have to do that quickly, right? Because the trip's about to go. The issue is if someone refuses to sign it, you don't have much you can do at this point, right? You've taken their money, they're signed up for the trip, and then to change the rules on them and say, well, you can't go now. Well, they weren't on notice for that. So I think one, it's going to cause all sorts of problems with your travelers, which you don't want, right? So I think it's something to think about. I don't know what this trip entails. It might be, key enough that you want that.
I mean, is it a risk to not include a liability, to not include a waiver along that with that trip now? You're a month away. But it's something that, I mean, I know you're not here giving out advice. There's no legal advice here. But is it something to consider to be aware that there is a risk in not attaching a waiver to that booking? I think you're just on mute.
Thanks. Yes, there was an unexpected doorbell ring.
Don't worry about it.
To spare you from someone like pressing it too much. No, yeah, I think, I mean, the issue is the timing. So I think if you were to use use a liability waiver, the issue is that, you might be vulnerable to an argument down the road if you try to enforce it that, hey, you sort of slipped this in, right? Yep. So, but I can't opine right now based at all as to what a judge might do. So there is some chance that a judge would uphold that if a person signed it, right? You're not handing it to them when they arrive at the destination. You are doing it sometime before. So I think if there's a way to do it without turning off your customers and just saying, hey, here's a liability waiver, I think it's worth a shot.
Okay. And then I want to ask one other question from Robert Craig, who also earlier in the chat did mention that ACTA, Canada as a trade association, does have a sample waiver available for Canadians looking for that kind of language. But you mentioned timing, Chun, and I'm wondering, Robert's wondering too, what is the optimal timing of getting a waiver signed? Is it at booking? Is it prior to final payment? Is there any advice you could give us there?
I would say that's a great question. I spend a lot of time with companies thinking about the timing of it. There's some practical considerations, but as early as possible. And I say that because with respect to a waiver, there are some structured rules and elements that courts apply in determining whether or not a waiver should be upheld. And so one of the issues is clear and conspicuous language, which I think we'll get to in a bit. But also that a person voluntarily signed it. That's true of any contract. So if you present a waiver too late or under circumstances that might be considered duress, that will make your waiver vulnerable to being just not upheld. So some companies do choose to provide the waiver at booking, right? Some, I would say more often, what they do is they might have the waiver available on the website. So anybody could look at it anytime, even pre-booking. They book, and maybe when they book, there's a notice saying you'll have to sign a liability waiver, and there's a link to it. But then they sign it after they've booked. Sometimes companies don't want to load up documents right at the beginning. They just want to get the booking. They might show the terms and conditions. But I would say I wouldn't wait until final payment. Once a person looks at a waiver, they might start to ask questions. They may not want to travel. And so you have to deal with that sooner rather than later, right? You don't want to wait until final payment and someone starts to get nervous about the waiver. That causes all sorts of problems. So what most of my clients do is send the waiver soon after booking, if not at booking. And then if somebody wants their money back because they haven't seen the waiver before and they didn't know that they would have to agree to it, the companies are typically prepared to give a refund. Okay. That's just the cost of waiting to present the waiver, and they understand that.
Okay. And I know I see some comments and questions coming in. And again, we're gonna drop your website, Chun, at the end of this, so people, if they're interested in contacting you directly, they have your details. There is one more question, and then I want to get into the language like we spoke about, like you mentioned. Melissa wants to know, what are your options if someone refuses to sign a waiver that you've passed along? Whatever step in the process you have it. Say it's ideal and you have it at the beginning of the booking process. Is that sort of a deal breaker when you're working with a client?
I would say for companies that have been at it for a while, because I do think your mentality changes the longer you've been in business and experienced certain things. But for them, not signing the waiver is non-negotiable. And I would say here that I always say that waivers, yes, they're a contract, but they're also a screening tool. Waivers have a way of sort of sussing out people who really shouldn't be going on the trip. Maybe there's pressure from their family to go. They're not feeling good about the trip for some reason. And no matter how much you want that booking, that person may not be right for the trip, because if they're looking for the waiver, if they're kind of nitpicking the waiver, just think of what they're going to nitpick later. Yeah. Right? Like 99% of the time, that's a person who's going to complain about everything that happens on a trip. And then, boy, if something happens, they're going to sue you. No. That's always a risk. But sometimes what we find is someone might want an edit to the waiver. I would say generally no editing. You're not striking out language, except once in a while, someone will ask for an edit that is consistent with the law. For instance, you can't waive gross negligence, right? That's against public policy. You cannot, by contract, have someone sign away the right to sue you for doing something purposely, right? You sabotage their trip on purpose. No, you can't get that waived. You are grossly negligent, right? Let's say I like scuba diving. Let's say I go to some dive shop. I know I could go down and something could happen underwater, but what I don't expect is that they're not servicing the tanks, right? They're not doing those things. They've got all sorts of safety violations. That can't be waived. So if somebody wants to kind of tinker with it and add in that they're not waiving the right to sue you for gross negligence or intentional misconduct, I'm okay with that because that mirrors the law. We
Okay.
can say that for in a particular situation.
Okay. And I see I'm seeing a lot of great questions come in, but I do want to move on now, and I promise I will circle back, and then we'll try to grab the rest that come in the next over the next 18 to 20 minutes or so. But let's talk about the language because you mentioned language. I know that's an important part of these products of these waivers. Earlier in the week when we sort of touched base to talk about this session, you mentioned about painting with a broad brush, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the benefit of that when you're building a waiver.
Sure. So when I say that waivers should be painted with a broad brush, so there's a level of specificity that's required in the waiver, but my point of that is the waiver should sort of think about the broad bucket of risk and touch upon those, right? What we saw with the pandemic with waivers that I didn't handle was that some of them didn't even talk about the fact that there were risks such as getting sick on a trip. They just totally overlooked illness, sickness, pandemic, or epidemic. So you want to sort of touch upon the buckets of risk that could happen. So, right, like there could be criminal activity, there could be government action like border closures,
Yeah.
could be transportation failures, all of those things. So that's what painting, with a broad brush means.
Yeah. And I know, and again, you mentioned all those things, and it is important to think about that this was a major, this was a concern even before COVID was even a part of the vocabulary. There was things happened abroad. I know it's tough to imagine now because COVID's
Yeah.
still top of mind for everyone, but things happened abroad. Borders were closed. Accidents happen. We talked about, I think, volcanoes the other day. That would seem to be a regular occurrence. Hurricanes, weather, acts of God. So it is important to make sure you're covered for all of that. Um, so I'm going to grab another question, and this is just goes back to sort of the best practices when dealing with clients when it comes to waivers. Cindy earlier asked if we need a waiver for every client. Does having a waiver for a client sort of suffice for their whole time with you as a relationship or travel advisor, or do you need one for every single booking with a client?
Um, so the question is, you have a client that's sort of a repeat, right? And they go
Yes.
on different trips. I mean, if they're going with you every week, then you might be able to do something that's sort of kind of one waiver that covers those trips. But we would want to say something in there that the waiver covers multiple trips. We
Okay.
typically see this where people are going to outside of the travel context, but let's say a club, right? You don't want to sign a waiver every single time you go. So that waiver sort of applies to all visits. Doesn't work as well in the travel industry and with sort of discrete trips that have gaps in between. In that case, then yes, I would have them sign a waiver each time.
Okay. And then one more question, and then we're going to get back to sort of the other questions that we've prepared. We have a question coming in that says, what about when a supplier has terms and conditions of their own? Does that suffice when it comes to the advisor client relationship, or does it not? And should those be things that you review with your client as well?
Great question. And this is one of the trickier areas where you have multiple entities in the travel supply chain with their own documents, right? There's all sorts of conflict, sorts of confusing, and you don't want to present a big thick stack of papers to your travelers. So the question regarding does the supplier's waiver suffice? You have to read what it says, and who's the supplier, right? If it's a supplier in another country that sort of has a small operation, well, one, I'd be surprised if they have a waiver. But secondly, if they do have one, there's a pretty good chance that you are not covered as a travel advisor in that, right? So you could always negotiate with your supplier and say, I want to be included in this waiver, and I only want one waiver, so I'm not going to have my own. That's one possibility. But don't just assume it's covered. You've got to read it. Does it cover travel advisors, right? Like we talked about successors and assigns, see who is included. But let's say your supplier's document doesn't include you. Maybe for whatever reason, it doesn't make sense for you to be incorporated into their waiver, then get your own. I think that's the solution there.
Okay. And I think we grabbed most of the most appropriate questions from the chat. But again, we do have some time. I'm sure we'll have a couple minutes at the end. Any other questions, we're going to do our best to address them. I want to ask one more thing about waivers and about the relationships with the clients. You mentioned before the timing of presenting them to your clients, and that sometimes can not only be appropriate and make it easier for them to get signed, but also sort of reveal the client's character. And I'm curious, do you have any advice aside from timing and how advisors can present these to clients without them seeming daunting or scary?
Well, there's no way to avoid some of the scary language,
Okay.
and it does have scary language, right? Like the solution isn't to delete that. And I have like a sample waiver here that I crafted, but we specifically say things like you are, you know that your trip has a risk of emotional trauma, disfigurement, temporary or permanent disability, including paralysis, death, acts of God. I mean, it's pretty, sounds pretty horrific, and it touches on stuff none of us like to think about. Like, I don't want to think about getting disfigured. But the reality is people are accustomed to seeing waiver language, especially with travel and especially with the pandemic, right? I think people are a bit just used to it. So hopefully they're less scary. But I always say that if a traveler trusts you and has confidence in you, in your business, then they're going to sign the waiver with an understanding the purpose of it, right? So I say it goes all back to customer service. And that's where every part of your business, if it communicates, trust and honesty, and that you'll do the right thing, like what's your travel story? What's your story as a business? And if customers are confident about that, they'll be confident about signing a waiver and traveling with you.
Yeah. It's interesting. We've done a couple, 3 or 4 sessions at this point on travel agent fees, and I know that's something we actually want to talk about a little later. But the presentation of the fees and the presentation of the liability waivers and terms and conditions seem to follow a lot of the same issues about when you do it. What do you do when a client has a pushback on it? So it is a discussion that advisors might be having with themselves already about timing and things like that. So it's just something to think about. We have one more question in the chat, and I think this is a good one too. And I know we said we'd be giving out your contact info later, but just in general, if someone is searching for the right lawyer to review and edit a waiver, do you have any advice on where advisors would be able to start? Is there a particular type of lawyer they should search for this kind of business?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of resources. Obviously, we're a resource, but I would say check with your host agency. They probably work with lawyers or trade association, but also there's the International Forum of Travel and Tourism Lawyers, which I'm a member of. And so there's a list of lawyers in different jurisdictions that practice in the travel industry. So that's a good place. I think if you Google travel lawyers who specifically practice in this area, you can find those. And just word of mouth is a good way. The reality is any lawyer that deals with contracts, particularly, I would say in the outdoor industry or travel, like adjacent industries, are familiar with this. But I think importantly, it's an opportunity to find a travel specific lawyer who you can grow with over time and who understands the business. Business lawyers that deal with contracts that don't work with travel companies won't know your business. So I would say sort of go for the lawyers that have travel clients.
I mean, I don't know if you could answer this too, and it might be just a quick question, but you mentioned Googling travel lawyers, and I assume that there's going to be a lot of results that come up. Do you have any advice on vetting when you see contacts or when you see options when you do the online search for trying to find a travel lawyer?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, look and compare what they uh, say about their work. Is it sort of a one-off situation, or is this an area they regularly work in? Look and see what their professional affiliations are. Are they working with travel groups? Like, for instance, I'm an advisory board member of the Adventure Travel Trade Association. I'm on some, related
Yeah.
boards. And so I think those things give you sort of indicia that this lawyer knows what they're talking about. On top of that, get a lawyer that you enjoy calling and talking to. There's nothing worse than, right, having advisors that you just don't want to pick up the phone. So rapport and relationships also apply to lawyers, right? Someone that you feel like you can work with.
And we just had a comment in the chat. We already mentioned ACTA, and I'm sure ACTA has this as well. But ASTA, the American Society of Travel Advisors, has access to lawyers, and I'm sure, again, like you mentioned, it is a good resource. The trade associations are there to help you, and it is a great resource if you're looking for a lawyer. I have no doubt that they'd have some recommendations or somewhere to point you. So we did mention fees before, and I know that's something we discussed earlier in the week, and I want to ask you that question, which might be sort of outside of the liability waiver discussion, but I do want to get it in here before we end the session. I asked you earlier in the week if you saw any major issues outside of liability waivers that you could see impacting the travel industry going forward or impacting travel advisor business. And you mentioned fees and how you talk about what you charge in your terms and conditions. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I know fees are becoming more and more a common business practice among advisors these days.
Yes. So the pandemic, I think, really sort of sussed out some sort of vulnerabilities and deficiencies with respect to how fees are communicated. Typically, pre-pandemic, there was just sort of like, okay, pay your deposit money and it's for your trip. And that got really difficult for companies facing refund requests, because the traveler's mind is, well, I didn't go on my trip, so I should get all the money back, right? They're not thinking about some of this money goes on to suppliers, no matter what you say about deposits and how they're non-refundable. But also getting paid yourself. There were a number of companies that didn't take commissions or didn't charge a fee for planning. So they spent all this time up to the pandemic planning these trips and weren't getting paid, right? That's why so many people relied on PPP loans, didn't have cash reserves, because it was kind of like the Great Depression where everyone's going and trying to get their money, and there's no money to be had. You can't deal with everybody coming and making a run for monies that are on hold for them. So I think what that has really spurred is a great discussion about how do we talk about deposits and fees, and breaking out like what a trip planning fee. So what I've seen in my practice is, we've been discussing that a lot, and the new practice now is to set out that, okay, this bucket of money that is paid as a deposit, it consists of, a fee for our services, right? We start to generate and do that work from day one. And you don't get that back. So really trying to segment the money that you should charge as a fee from kind of the other money, which is for implementing the trip, right? That goes through your suppliers. I think this is an area that's still in flux. Companies are doing different things, but I think we will see greater transparency regarding fees. I think another big issue is related to fees is credit card chargebacks. So we saw a lot of things happening there. So really making sure you have good language around credit card chargebacks that you can present to credit card companies if somebody tries to get around your cancellation policy and refund policy by doing a credit card chargeback.
Yeah, COVID definitely put enough stress in the industry that those issues that were sort of unique uh, 24 months ago have become commonplace now. The chargeback issue in particular has become incredibly common, especially in the early months of COVID too. So I think that's great advice. We do have a question on fees, and I'm hoping you can answer this as well. Anne wants to know, does charging fees increase your liability at all? Or is that too general of a question?
Yeah, it's a little, some of this it's not yet tested in court, so we don't know how a court would interpret that and its impact on liability. But the reality is, to the extent that you are involved in the travel planning and providing and organizing, you're always going to be at risk of being sued. The reality is, most cases, if you have insurance, don't ever get to the point of a court determining substantive liability. The reality is that cases end up getting settled. You get sued, there's a settlement. And so how court would interpret, we may not know for a long time.
Yeah.
But I think there's still risk of not necessarily liability, but still risk of getting sued.
Yeah. So I have one more COVID question, and then I'm gonna wrap it up. I do want to mention that I know a lot of people came in midway through today's session. Again, this is available for free on demand on travelmarkreport.com and on our YouTube page, so you can watch that. You can rewind and pause and make sure you caught everything we've been going over today. I know there's been a lot. But just because COVID's still very much an issue, and I know this is going to be an ongoing discussion with other stuff going forward too. I mean, for the liability waivers, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about whether or not people are modifying the waivers to specifically address COVID issues now, and whether that's something that's important for advisors to think about.
Most are. Some companies, I would say there are some outlier companies that don't want to get so deep into COVID, just because I think with all the risks that are in a waiver, you could spend a lot of time kind of fleshing out them all. So I've seen sort of two approaches. One is to definitely include in this sort of general bucket, paint with a broad brush approach, to include in the list of risk, pandemic related risk, sanitation deficiencies, right? Sort of in that omnibus language. But I would say a number are, especially now because things are still so uncertain, is kind of a separate paragraph talking about COVID-19 and the risk around that. And part of it is really more of an educational too. So that if someone comes back and says, oh, I was quarantined and you owe me money, it's like, no, we disclose that here. So what I'm seeing is most companies are putting at least a paragraph in saying, you absolve us from some liability for COVID-19 related risk, and then kind of describing all the things, or at least the core things that could happen, right? So being denied services, being denied entry into another country, something happening during the trip, right? Like getting quarantined because somebody else is sick. Yep. Language regarding, you're disseminating information about what your suppliers do in the country in terms of sanitation and dealing with COVID, but you ultimately don't manage and can't guarantee that they're abiding by what they say. So that's what we're seeing is the trend.
Okay. All right, so I think we've answered all the questions. I think we've covered everything we wanted to cover today. I do want to get your contact info or your website into the chat, so we can go ahead and do that. If anyone has outstanding questions, I'm sure you'll be willing to look at them or consider them. But I do want to give you a couple minutes. If there's anything you think we missed, anything you want to say to the advisors on the call today, that you want to mention before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I would say just a couple of additional points with respect to waivers and just the process of those. So, prepare your waiver, keep good records. I would encourage you to use an electronic signature system. It just makes it a lot easier to collect signatures, to organize electronic documents, to retrieve them if you ever need to retrieve them. So I would just sort of give that recommendation. And I would just say, don't be afraid of working with lawyers. This is what we do. It makes your job a lot easier. And I would say just, create a waiver, get started, don't linger on it. The sooner you do it, the better, especially with what's going on with the pandemic. And with that, I would just thank everyone for being here today and for talking about waivers. I really enjoyed it, and happy to help anybody who needs it. So just let us know.
Yeah, and I know there were some questions we didn't get to. If you want to email me, I'm dmccarthy@travelmarkreport.com, and hopefully we can pass it along to Chun and we can get it figured out. But I wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today. I know well we mentioned at the beginning of the session that sometimes this stuff is scary, and it didn't seem as scary coming from you. And I hope I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of the advisors on the call learned a lot too.
Thank you so much. And
All
good
right.
luck to everybody.
Yeah. So for everybody else, thank you again for joining me. This is will be available on demand, like I mentioned. Otherwise, hope to see you back here in 2 weeks. Where we're having a new advisor come on to talk about. I believe we're up to romance, travel, and destination weddings. So please come back for that. And otherwise, hope you have a rest.